This week on Wood-Fired Weekly, we're going to be making a ciabatta and we're going to do a step-by-step recipe. It's going to be a fantastic, open-textured, lovely, light and bubbly bread. To start this recipe, I've got 00 flour in my bowl along with some instant yeast. So I'm going to mix that up, and to that I'm just going to add some water. In this recipe I'm going to be using around about 85% hydration. And that means it's going to be a really sticky dough. So you'll notice that when I mix this up, it's going to turn pretty much into a batter. And all I'm going to do at this stage is just mix everything together, excluding the salt, as you can see. And I've got this really very, very sticky, sloppy dough. And the technique I'm going to show you today is one which pretty much avoids kneading. Because if we tried to knead this bread by hand, it would be really difficult. We'd just get in an absolute mess. So what I want to do first of all is just give the dough a quick battering. Break up all of the lumps, get everything hydrated, and then let it stand. So to do that, I hold the bowl up a little bit and just beat the dough, turn the bowl, beat the dough, turn the dough, beat the dough. So what I've done there is put lots of energy into the dough, and that's going to allow the proteins to start developing, coming together as gluten, and even in this very sticky mass, it's going to create a glutinous dough. I'm going to set that aside for about 15 minutes and then come back to stage 2. After 15 minutes, the dough won't look very different at all, although we might just see a couple of little bubbles there where the yeast is starting to get a little bit active. What we're going to do now is put some more energy into this dough, and that means it's going to strengthen up a little bit more. The proteins are starting to working and coming together that little bit better. We're also going to add the salt at this stage. The reason for leaving the salt out, sometimes called the auto-leesing method, is because the dough will become a little bit more extensible if the salt is left out. Salt has this fantastic effect of strengthening protein and giving us a very glutinous dough, and without salt, bread tends to be quite cakey and likely to break and be much flatter. But if we leave it out for just a little bit, the protein actually becomes more extensible, so those holes that we're trying to get inside our ciabatta can become a little bit bigger. And you can do this for pretty much any bread you're using. Just leave the salt out for the first half an hour of the process. Back in with my scraper, bring that together again and give it another batter. And can you see how that is now clearing the sides of the bowl better than it was before? Because we started to form a glutinous dough and because we've added the salt. Now I want to give this a good little beat to give it some energy and to mix all of that salt in thoroughly. And now I'm going to leave it again for another 15 minutes or so. If we have a look at this now, we can definitely see some yeast activity. We've got some nice bubbles in there. And if I stretch this, you can see it's got really quite strong, even though it's still a really, really, really wet dough. So I'm going to give it one more battering in the bowl, just to re-energize the dough. And you can see it's really quite smooth now. All the lumps have gone. It's got that lovely silky appearance of a well-developed dough. And it clears the bowl completely. So I can lift that up. It's a coherent piece of dough hanging together, whereas to start with it was just a mush. But it's still very, very soft. What we're going to do over the next couple of hours is continue to strengthen the dough, continue to develop the dough, but also to really open up the texture. And we're going to do this by stretching and folding the dough. I'm going to do this in this tray, and I'm going to do it with a little bit of water in the tray. And if I did this on flour, because it's such a wet dough, it would just keep sucking up that flour and sucking up that flour, and it would still be sticky. So water in there, and it seems crazy with such a wet dough to be adding more water, but believe me, it'll work. So I pop that onto the water, make sure it's all nicely lubricated underneath so it's not sticking to the tray. Stretch that out a little bit. And what we'll find is that this dough will relax and spread during this first phase. And then we'll give it a stretch and fold. It'll stretch and spread a little bit, but not quite as much as before. And it will sit up more. And the next time we'll do it, it'll sit up even more. So it's getting stronger and stronger and better able to hold its own shape, even as we open up the structure of the dough. What I'm also going to add at this stage are some flavourings, and this could be some sun-dried tomatoes, it could be some olives, could be some cooked mushrooms. I've got some crispy fried onions here, so I'm going to sprinkle those over, and then when we stretch and fold the dough, those will get distributed through the dough, and these are going to add great flavour to the finished bread. So we're going to cover this now, set it to one side for about 45 minutes. Room temperature is fine. And then do our first stretch and fold. The ciabatta's been resting for about 45 minutes now, so we're going to take a look. And you can see how this has spread across this tray a little bit, exactly as we expected. Now we're going to start this stretching and folding process. And whereas before, when we were battering the dough in the bowl, we could be as rough as we liked. Now we really want to be a little bit gentle with this dough, because we're trying to encourage this structure to open up, and if we're too heavy-handed, we just collapse that structure, knock the gases out, and get a flat kind of bread. So I'm going to just loosen it up from the base of the tray, scuffing a little bit of water underneath as I go, and then one wet hand, one wet scraper. I'm going to stretch and fold the dough. And if you imagine the bubbles inside this dough elongating as you stretch them, and then folding it over and holding those in place so they retain that lovely stretch, and the bubbles then start to get bigger and bigger. And what we hope we end up with in a ciabatta is more holes than actual dough. So stretch, fold it over, stretch and fold it over. You'll notice at this stage there's not much elasticity in the dough, but with each successive stretch and fold, and we're going to do 3 in total, it'll get a little bit more elastic. Stretch and fold, and also as the bubbles inside start to expand, it'll start to get very big, so it'll be probably 4 or 5 times its original volume. Never mind that old double in size nonsense. This is going to be 4 or 5 times as big. So I've just been once around the dough, and don't be tempted to keep going and keep going, because it feels so lovely and it's such a fun thing to do, because then you'll start knocking the gases out. So I'm going to flip the whole thing over, make sure there's a little water under there, pop it gently back on its spot, and set it to rest for another 45 minutes. Another 45 minutes, perhaps a little bit more, has passed since we last looked at the ciabatta. We're going to take another look. And as you can see, just as we thought, it spread a bit, but now it's starting to sit up even more and get bigger and bigger, and we can see lots of nice bubbles in here. So we know we've got a lot of activity, and these bubbles that we're hoping to see are starting to develop. A little splash of water around there. Wet scraper, wet hand, just loosen things up a little bit from the tray. And if you haven't got a tray, you can just do this on your normal work surface and sit a bowl over the top. As long as it doesn't dry out, it's going to be fine. And now we're going to give this another stretch and fold. Exactly the same process, but now we should notice a little bit more elasticity in the dough, so we might have to be a little bit firmer. But the important thing is, whilst being firm, not to be heavy-handed. So we give that a stretch, bring it over. I can certainly feel more elasticity there. Once around the dough, stretching it in every direction, and if it tries to spring back like that, just hold that in place for a few seconds, because having created that tension, having stretched out those bubbles, we don't want them to spring back again. So even though this is quite a long process to make the bread, each time I do this, you know, I'm only hands-on really for a few seconds. So that was stretch number 2. We'll do that one more time in another 45 minutes. See you in a while. It's been another 45 minutes, so we're going to give the ciabatta its final stretch and fold. A little splash of water, and we should find now it's got really quite elastic. So when I stretch it now, it's actually going to put up a little bit of a fight. And now I'm actually going to take the water away and replace it with semolina, because the next time we come to do this, we're going to cut the ciabatta to shape it and then bake it. So I'm going to mop around there, take away all that water, and then in there I'm going to generously sprinkle semolina. And this semolina will give the dough a nice outer coating, or the finished bread a nice outer coating I should say, but it will also make it much easier for us to move it and cut it and shape it. So now we sort of want everything, having had everything wet, we want everything dry. So we'll cover that over again. We've been fermenting this at quite a cool temperature. We want it to have plenty of time to develop flavour. And you could even do this as a much longer ferment and retard it, do the first couple of shapings, put that energy into the dough, then put it in the fridge overnight, let it ferment for a long time, 16 hours or so, and then take it out of the fridge and start doing that stretching and folding. So now it wants to be in a slightly warmer position than it's been for most of today, because we're doing this in our kind of outhouse here where it's been a bit cool. So now I'm going to move this inside into the kitchen and leave it there for sort of 45 minutes, and then we'll give it its final cutting and shaping. Finally, we should be ready to bake this ciabatta. It's had its final rise. If you remember that tiny little bit of dough we had in the bottom of the bowl to start with, it's now about 4 times the size of that. It's very soft. If I give it a wobble like that, you can see how it just kind of jiggles around, and if you could feel it, it feels sort of spongy. So I'm going to make this into 4 large ciabattas. We could make 6 or even 8 small ones. So another coating of semolina. And this is where it gets fun, because inside this is very sticky. So we have to be careful in how we shape this now. So I'm going to decide where I'm going to cut this first one and lay a little sort of line of semolina along there, and then I'm going to take a dry scraper and roll it through the dough. If I try and saw it, it'll stick and drag everywhere. If I just try and press down, it'll stick. So I just roll that through, scuff it away a little bit, roll it through, scuff it away a little bit, roll it through, scuff it away, and just let that roll over away from the dough. And now I get 2 scrapers, zip them underneath like that, straight out onto a piece of baking parchment. Much easier to do this on baking parchment and then put the baking parchment into the oven than it is to try and put them directly onto the floor. Now this dough is fully risen, and in this shaping process I'm not knocking it back at all. So I shouldn't need to let it rise again, because I'm not really shaping it, I'm just cutting it. I just straighten it up with 2 dough scrapers, so the shape is a little bit random, ideally kind of straight, but a little bit random. And then here's my final ciabatta. So we're not going to let them rise again, but we're just going to let them relax for 5 minutes. Just long enough for us to check that the oven is okay. So we're going to be using the small Bushman, which has been fully heated up. I've taken the embers out and got rid of those. I've shut the door, let the temperatures even out. So I'm going to use the infrared thermometer to check what we've got. Center of the floor 325, back wall 335, side wall 310, side wall 300. So a little bit over 300, 315 degrees average temperature down there where we're going to cook. Now that is not the cooking temperature, of course, that's the surface temperature, so I need to take a little bit off for that. So 15% or so coming off that. So let's say we are at 270 degrees, something in that range. Hot, hotter than your domestic oven will go. I'm going to use a spray to generously spray as the breads go in so that we've got a nice humid atmosphere, because now that the oven has been cleared out, we're not burning any wood, we're not releasing any moisture, so the oven is a very dry environment, which is great because it's going to give us a really beautiful crust on this bread. But we don't want that to happen straight away. Initially we want the bread to be able to rise, so we don't want the crust to set too quickly, so a good spray of water will create that humidity. In we go, lots of spray. And close the door to keep all that humidity in, but also so that the temperature is as even as possible. I'm going to leave it for 10 minutes, then I'm going to spin those breads round. It will be hotter at the back because the door's not really holding heat. Spin them round after 10 minutes, give them another 10 minutes, and that should be about right. Time to turn the ciabattas. You can see a lot of steam come out of the oven then when I open the door. So we're now letting all that steam out, and we're going to finish the cooking without steam. We've got some great colour happening on the bread. And actually I think another 5 or 6 minutes should be fine. Ciabatta's had another 5 minutes or so. We're going to take a look. Great smell of onions. Some of the onion on the outside just kind of scorches a little bit. That's nothing to worry about. Lovely hollow sound. Amazingly light. So we're just going to let those cool down for a few minutes, and then we'll slice into one and take a look inside. But that's how you make ciabatta. Fairly simple, albeit long-winded process, and really all about careful handling of the dough in order to open up a lovely texture inside. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll provide notes and a recipe on our website, and we'll provide a link to that in the notes below the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.